You probably noticed the headlines about US-China tensions, about trade disputes, about military posturing in the Pacific, and you assumed this was just another chapter in the familiar story of American dominance being challenged but ultimately preserved. But if that is where you stopped, you missed what is actually happening because we are witnessing something far more fundamental than cyclical tensions between great powers. We are witnessing a comprehensive reversal of the power dynamic that has defined the global order for the past 75 years. China is not merely rising to challenge American dominance. China is systematically turning the tables on every mechanism that the United States used to establish and maintain global hegemony. And the most remarkable part is that China is doing this using many of the same tools that America once wielded, but with far greater patience, far more strategic coherence, and far less ideological rigidity. I want to walk through this carefully because the implications extend far beyond US-China bilateral relations. This is about the architecture of global power itself being restructured in ways that will determine economic and political outcomes for the rest of the century. Let me start with the most visible shift: economic interdependence. For decades, the United States benefited enormously from being the indispensable economy countries needed access to American markets, American technology, American capital, and the dollar-denominated financial system. This gave Washington extraordinary leverage. If you wanted to participate in the global economy, you played by American rules. You accepted American priorities and you tolerated American unilateral actions. China watched the system and learned from it. But instead of trying to overthrow it directly, China integrated deeply and then built alternatives that gradually made American centrality optional. Today, China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries, more than the United States, more than the European Union. This is not just about volume, it is about dependency. When your economy relies on Chinese markets for exports, Chinese manufacturing for imports, and Chinese investment for infrastructure, you cannot simply cut ties because Washington demands it. Let me show you how this plays out in concrete examples because abstractions obscure the reality of changed incentives. Take Germany, Europe's largest economy and America's closest European ally. Germany exports over 100 billion euros annually to China, making China its largest trading partner. German automotive companies Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes generate enormous revenue from Chinese sales. When the United States pressured Germany to restrict Huawei equipment in its 5G networks, Germany delayed and equivocated because German companies feared Chinese retaliation. Eventually, Germany imposed some restrictions, but far weaker than the United States wanted. The economic stakes were too high. Or consider Australia, which has a formal alliance with the United States through ANZUS. In 2020, Australia called for an independent investigation into COVID origins. China responded with sanctions on Australian wine, barley, coal, and other exports. Australian businesses suffered billions in losses. The Australian government eventually moderated its rhetoric and quietly rebuilt commercial relationships with China. This is not capitulation. This is rational calculation that economic interests cannot be permanently sacrificed for symbolic political gestures. Brazil provides another example, the largest country in Latin America and increasingly important in global commodities. Brazil is now China's largest trading partner. Brazilian soybeans, beef, and iron ore go to China in quantities that dwarf trade with the United States. When the United States pressured Brazil to ban Huawei from 5G, Brazil refused. The economic relationship was too important. Throughout Southeast Asia, the pattern repeats. Countries that have security concerns about Chinese behavior and would prefer American balance against Chinese power nonetheless deepen economic ties with China because the alternatives are economically unviable. Vietnam has territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea, but China is Vietnam's largest trading partner. Vietnamese manufacturing depends on Chinese components and Chinese investment. The Philippines has similar tensions but cannot afford to decouple economically. Philippine exports to China generate revenue that supports millions of jobs. Even India, which has serious security competition with China, including border clashes that killed dozens, cannot fully decouple economically. China is India's largest source of imports. Indian manufacturing and infrastructure depend on Chinese goods. And despite government rhetoric about reducing dependence, trade continues growing. The United States is discovering that its leverage has eroded when it tries to pressure countries to choose between America and China. Most choose both, or increasingly, they quietly prioritize China because choosing both provides maximum optionality. Countries can access Chinese economic benefits while maintaining American security relationships. But when forced to choose, the economic calculus increasingly favors China, especially for countries where trade and investment matter more than abstract security commitments. We saw this pattern with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank when the United States opposed it and urged allies to stay out. Britain, Germany, France, South Korea, Australia all joined anyway because the economic logic outweighed political pressure. The Obama administration positioned AIB membership as a loyalty test, a choice between America and China. But American allies calculated that participating in Chinese-led institution was worth the diplomatic friction because infrastructure financing was a real need that American institutions were not adequately addressing. This was a humiliating defeat for American diplomacy, not because allies turned against America, but because they decided American opposition was not sufficient reason to forego economic opportunity. We see it with Belt and Road Initiative countries signing up despite American warnings because Chinese infrastructure investment fills needs that American policy does not address. Over 140 countries have joined Belt and Road, including NATO members, European Union states, and American treaty allies. These are not hostile countries. These are partners who calculated that Chinese investment in ports, railways, power plants creates tangible benefits that outweigh American concerns about Chinese influence. The United States offers critiques of Belt and Road warnings about debt traps and sovereignty compromises, but it does not offer comparable investment at comparable scale. So countries take the investment and manage the risks rather than forego development to satisfy Washington. We see it in technology, where American attempts to isolate Chinese companies like Huawei have largely failed because too many countries need what these companies offer at prices they can afford. Huawei 5G equipment is not just cheaper than European alternatives. It is often better in terms of features, performance, and support. Countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia do not have unlimited budgets. They cannot afford to pay premium prices for geopolitical alignment. When American officials tell these countries not to use Huawei without offering affordable alternatives, the response is predictable. They use Huawei anyway. This does not reflect anti-American sentiment. It reflects economic necessity and the reality that American preferences no longer automatically override local interests. The fundamental shift is that American threats used to be enough to change behavior. Now, they are not countries still value the American relationship, but they no longer believe they must sacrifice economic interests to maintain it. This is leverage inversion, and it is accelerating. Now, look at technology, another domain where American dominance seemed permanent. For decades, the United States led in virtually every critical technology sector: semiconductors, telecommunications, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, software, and computing. Other countries either bought American technology, licensed it, or remained behind. China initially fit this pattern. It imported American chips, used American software, and relied on American technical standards. But China made a strategic decision to achieve technological autonomy, not by rejecting global integration, but by systematically developing domestic alternatives while remaining embedded in global supply chains. The results are now undeniable in renewable energy technology: solar panels, wine, turbines, batteries. China completely dominates not through protectionism, but through massive investment and relentless cost reduction. Chinese companies now produce over 80% of global solar manufacturing capacity. They produce batteries at costs American companies cannot match. They dominate electric vehicle production and sales and telecommunications despite American sanctions and export controls. Huawei and other Chinese firms continue advancing 5G technology is now deployed across much of the global south using Chinese equipment because it works and costs less than alternatives in artificial intelligence. China is competitive or leading in multiple domains: facial recognition, natural language processing, and autonomous systems. Chinese companies have access to the world's largest data sets in many categories. They have strong technical talent, and they have government support for research and commercialization. American export controls on advanced chips were supposed to Chinese AI development. Instead, they accelerated China's investment in domestic chip production and alternative AI architectures. This is the paradox of using technological denial as a weapon. It works in the short term, but it creates long-term incentives for the target to develop independence. And once that independence exists, you have lost leverage permanently. China is also turning tables on financial power. The dollar's role as global reserve currency has been a cornerstone of American hegemony. It allows the United States to run deficits without immediate consequences, to sanction countries by cutting them off from dollar clearing systems, and to effectively print money that the world accepts. China cannot yet dethrone the dollar, but it is systematically reducing dollar dependence for itself and offering alternatives to others. The digital yuan is being positioned as an alternative for international transactions, especially with countries that face American sanctions. China has established currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing bilateral trade to bypass dollars entirely. Chinese banks have created payment systems like CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system that provide alternatives to SWIFT, which the United States uses to enforce sanctions. This infrastructure is growing slowly but steadily. Every country that faces American financial pressure has incentive to use it, and every transaction that bypasses the dollar slightly reduces American leverage. The shift is incremental but directional 20 years ago. Dollar alternatives were fantasies today. They are operational realities in another 20 years. They may be the dominant infrastructure for much of the global economy. Military power reveals perhaps the starkest reversal. The United States maintains enormous military advantages in many domains: nuclear weapons, aircraft carriers, global bases, and power projection capability. But military power is context dependent. It matters most when it can be credibly threatened or actually used to achieve political objectives. In the Western Pacific, China is making American military dominance increasingly irrelevant. China has built the world's largest navy by ship count. It has deployed anti-ship missiles that threaten American carriers. It has created anti-access area denial systems that make operating near China extremely risky for American forces. More importantly, China has made clear that Taiwan is a core interest worth fighting for, while American willingness to actually fight for Taiwan remains ambiguous. This creates asymmetry of interest and commitment that undermines deterrence. If China believes it cares more about Taiwan than America does, and if China has capabilities to impose unacceptable costs on American intervention, then American military superiority becomes abstract rather than decisive. The United States faced a similar dynamic in Vietnam. Overwhelming military power proved insufficient when the adversary was willing to absorb costs that Americans were not. China is also turning tables on the international institutional architecture. After World War II, the United States built a system of international institutions: the United Nations World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, that embedded American power in multilateral frameworks. These institutions gave American preferences structural permanence. They made American priorities appear neutral and universal, and they provided platforms for American influence. China initially accepted these institutions even when rules disadvantaged China because participation brought benefits. But as China grew stronger, it began shaping institutions from within and building parallel structures. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank competes with the World Bank. The new development bank created by BRICS countries provides alternative development financing. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization creates regional security architecture independent of American alliances. These are not revolutionary attempts to overthrow the existing order. They are gradual construction of alternative order that makes American institutions less central and less essential. And this matters because institutional power is durable. Once alternative institutions exist and demonstrate effectiveness, they attract members and resources and legitimacy. The United States is experiencing what Britain experienced in the mid-10th century, watching the institutional architecture of its hegemony become gradually irrelevant. The narrative shift is equally important. For decades, the United States claimed to represent universal values, democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economics. This narrative provided moral legitimacy that complemented material power. Countries aligned with America, not just because of benefits, but because American leadership seemed to serve broader good. China is now offering a counter-narrative that resonates in much of the developing world. China does not claim moral superiority. It claims non-inference. It promises infrastructure investment without political conditions. It offers economic partnership without lecturing about domestic governance. And crucially, China points to its own experience lifting 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years as evidence that its model works. This is profoundly threatening to American soft power because it suggests that American-style democracy is not the only path to prosperity and development. When developing countries look at America, they see political dysfunction, infrastructure decay, and growing inequality. When they look at China, they see massive infrastructure rising, living standards, and effective governance. The narrative is shifting from American triumphalism to Chinese pragmatism. And narratives matter because they shape how countries interpret events and make strategic choices. Now consider how all these dimensions interact. Economic interdependence makes sanctions less effective, which reduces financial leverage. Technological independence makes export controls less powerful. Military regional superiority makes deterrence less credible. Institutional alternatives make American platforms less essential, and narrative shift makes American leadership less legitimate. These are not separate trends. They are mutually reinforcing. Every Chinese success in one domain strengthens its position in others. Every American attempt to use coercive power demonstrates declining leverage, which accelerates the search for alternatives. This is the doom loop of hegemonic decline. The United States is trying to maintain dominance through increasingly aggressive use of the tools that previously sustained hegemony: tariffs, sanctions, export controls, military posturing, institutional pressure. But these tools are losing effectiveness precisely because they are being used so aggressively. Countries that once accepted American leadership because it provided benefits with minimal costs now face demands that require them to sacrifice economic interests for political alignment. This forces them to develop alternatives to reduce dependence, which reduces American leverage, which makes America more aggressive, which accelerates diversification. China benefits at every stage, not because China is superior, but because China offers what countries increasingly want: economic opportunity without political demands. And this brings us to the fundamental question: why is this happening now? The simple answer is that material realities have changed. China is now large enough, economically advanced enough technologically, and confident enough politically to resist American pressure. But the deeper answer is about strategic choices. The United States could have managed China's rise through accommodation and integration, ensuring that Chinese interests were aligned with maintaining an open global system. Instead, American policy, especially in recent years, has treated China as an enemy to be contained. This approach might have worked if executed 20 years ago, when China was weaker and more dependent. But today, it is too late. China is too strong, too integrated, and too capable of building alternatives. The result is that American policy is achieving the opposite of its intent. Trying to isolate China drives other countries into Chinese partnerships. Trying to restrict Chinese technology accelerates Chinese innovation. Trying to contain Chinese influence demonstrates American weakness. This is the paradox of decline management. The harder you fight to preserve dominance, the faster you lose it. China understands this dynamic, which is why Chinese strategy is built on patience. China does not need to defeat the United States. It just needs to provide viable alternatives and wait for countries to make rational choices over time. Those choices accumulate into structural transformation. We are watching that transformation happen in real time. 20 years ago, American dominance seemed permanent. Today, it looks contingent. 20 years from now, it may look historical. This is not inevitable. the United States retains enormous advantages: technological innovation, higher education, entrepreneurial culture, military capability, alliance networks. But advantages are not enough without strategy. An American strategy is trapped between nostalgia for past dominance and refusal to accept present reality. China, by contrast, has a clear strategic vision, building a multipolar world where Chinese interests are protected and advanced not through domination, but through integration and alternative structures. China is turning tables not by defeating America, but by making American approval increasingly irrelevant. And that is the most profound shift of all. When countries stop asking for American permission, when they stop fearing American sanctions, when they stop accepting American institutional leadership, the era of American hegemony is over, not with dramatic collapse, but with gradual erosion as power diffuses eastward and options multiply. We are living through that transition right now, and the question is not whether the shift will continue, but how America will respond with adaptation and realism or with denial and escalation, because those choices will determine not just American influence, but global stability for decades to